Hello.
I'm never
Welcome.
entirely sure. Although there is a countdown, I'm never entirely sure when it's gonna like start and finish.
It's
Um,
kind of abrupt. I don't know if there's any way
it
to
is.
make it less
You
abrupt.
sort of. I don't know how to be prepared. Should I just like sit here for a minute and just intently stare? Um, I don't know. What's your approach to this
When
incredible
it gets to like
profession?
5 seconds, I take like a deep breath and then I try to smile authentically before it
Trying
opens
to smile authentic.
without doing like a Chandler smile.
I think that's what I always end up with, just kind of just slightly,
Yeah.
a grimace. Yeah. Anyway,
Well, here
hello
we are.
everyone.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 5 of season 10 of Disasters Deconstructed. We've been having lots of really fun live stream discussions at the start of 2025, all related to the upcoming book, which is exciting.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure you've heard all about this before already. It's episode 5. We keep repeating the same thing, but basically, last year Jason and I had this great idea that we're going to write the best book of all time. We're not actually going to write it. We're going to edit it because that makes things much more fun. And I think for those of you who've been following the podcast for a while now, you know that Jason and I have been reading and really reading outside of discipline for years, and we have been discussing kind of why this is important to us with so many of our colleagues and friends. And so that's what this contemplating catastrophe project is about. We've invited scholars, practitioners, our friends, colleagues, people we've never met before, to write a 1,000-word entry for us that introduces their favorite thinker or thinker that who really influenced their work in disaster scholarship and practice. And we also wanted these thinkers not to be from disaster scholarship. And it's been great. So just today we're looking at the list. We have 78 entries. I think that's going to be our probably more or less final-ish number. And of course, there are so many more thinkers that we wish we had entries for. So maybe there'll be volume 2 and 3 and 52. Yet another project that we have started and we will never fully finish. But it's really, really great. And so today we are going to talk about Black power and Black scholarship, and we have quite a few entries that focus on this, and this is really exciting for us. We of course talked about Black power and Black scholarship in our previous seasons, in particular the amazing season curated with our comrade Darian Alexander Williams. I can't quite remember what season it was, but it was somewhere in the middle. So for those of you who are new to Disasters Deconstructed, please go back and kind of look at the archives. Jason is thinking intently. I can see
I'm
that, but
thinking maybe 4.
I won't say 4 or 5, but it was just such fun season. And of course, all the work we've been doing with Darian, we just love working with him. He's just a great comrade and it's so great to play with. So anyway, today we continue this conversation about Black power and Black scholarship because there is so much to learn from.
True. I'm looking through the
You're looking for
archives.
this
No,
season.
you threw
Gross.
me there.
Um,
I think it's 5. Anyway, I'll get back to you on that one. Um, and I think anybody who's familiar with Disasters Deconstructed will know our guests today who are joining us for this conversation. I'm going to bring them on the screen. We have with us Dewald and Danielle. Back again.
Back again.
Back again. Danielle Rivera, welcome. Danielle's an assistant professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning at UC Berkeley. Her work examines policy and design for environmental and climate justice and engages rural and unincorporated marginalized communities, challenging government agencies to recognize the communities and alter outdated policy and programmatic frameworks. Welcome back, Danielle. So good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
And Dewald van Niekerk is a professor at the Northwest University in South Africa. His work focuses on the marginalized communities impacted by hazards, and he's also the founder and editor-in-chief of JAMBA, Journal of Disaster Risk Studies. Dewald played a significant role in establishment of the Southern Africa Society for Disaster Reduction. Welcome back, Dewald, as well.
Thank you very much for having me once again.
Great to have you back, both of you. And we do invite you, not because we're sure want to invite the conversation we had pre-live stream today, but because we really love your work, so it's wonderful to have you back, and we really appreciate your contributions to our project. So this season, we actually start every episode with the same question to all our guests, because we want to learn about your inspiration for thinking and for your scholarship. So we start at each episode with a question about your reading. Danielle, I'll start with you. So what do you read, and how have you started reading the stuff that you're reading? What inspires you in your work?
Oh yeah, I saw this question and I've been mulling it over. I still don't really know how I got to the work that I'm reading. I was like, how did I even get here? But I think really for me, a lot of the research I do, the tacks I take, the theoretical frameworks come from really wanting to understand fully the experiences of communities in and through disaster, or in my earlier work, before I even was studying disaster, that was really about environmental justice and trying to understand the issues that communities were facing on the ground, their real experiences. And so, I read a lot of art and poetry and the experiences from people like Laura Ansel-Dua, and trying to explain that experience of living by the U.S.-Mexico border. What was that really like for someone like her, and how she theorizes those experiences, and that kind of led to Paulo Freire and others who are sort of that next level of like organizing community and how we think through that. And that's kind of my into the environmental justice literature, and then the disaster literature. That's really the tact I've taken sort of through that. So yeah. It's a little circuitous, but that's how I got here.
No, but this is great, and it's just so nice, I think, for us to be finding more and more common reading grounds with our guests, because I think we all come from such different disciplinary backgrounds that actually kind of realizing that in the end we all read a lot of the same stuff, but also very different things, and I think that's what kind of makes the scholarship really exciting.
Yeah.
So Dawal, same to you. What do you read? How have you started reading it? Like, what inspires your work?
Well, I currently read the work of Barlow, Chono, Guarani, Maton. You won't know these because those are all my postgraduate students at this stage, which is quite a level of frustration, because we tend to get caught up with all these reading of theses and assignments, etc.
I love that answer.
This is the best answer ever.
Shout out to all those students who's listening. You've got your name on the podcast now. That's not going to count any extra marks. No, my journey was an interesting one. I came from a few disciplines: development studies, political science, geography, human geography, and that was kind of the foundation reading where I started off. My interest was much more on international political economy, interregional issues, specifically conflict in different regions, and that led me kind of into the disaster risk domain. So, I mean, all the big readers, the guys that we know of, Huntington and Nye and Conyers and Hills, and those are the guys that kind of gave me the foundation. Very few women that we were prescribed at reading when I started off my studies in the early 1990s, obviously. But then obviously that also opened up where many more South African scholars came online looking at our political situation, Skuman and the lot. And that kind of formed the foundation of my idea in political thought. But what actually I think shaped me in disaster management, or looking at disaster risk management later on, was obviously the work of Mapela Rampele, which we will talk about a bit later on. But also the more earlier disaster risk scholars, like the work of Fred Kearney. I think he was probably one of the first ones that I read. And all the I'm going to call them older generation, like those that's still alive, probably give me a hiding for this. But Ben Weisner, Terry Coleman, Susan Cutter, Anthony Oliver Smith, Ken Ewart, Quarantelli Dines, all the initial scholars that was writing about disaster management as we understood it, and that also expanded into so many other fields, like the work that Marine Fordham was working, and that had a massive impact on me. Also work for Alsha Holloway, Colleen Vogel, More recently, Thea Hilos, there's so many of them that, we know all of these names, but I think their work still remains the foundation of what goes on in disaster risk studies. And that was very kind of a funnel for me. And later on, I would say later on, probably the past 10 years or so, it opened up a bit more for me when the whole focus on much more transdisciplinary disaster risk issues came about. And I, interesting enough, started reading a lot more in practice aspects. For instance, reports from the field, biographies written by people, foreign journalists and correspondents in some of these zones and working in development. And that's where my reading kind of opened up more to other disciplines and, interesting things people are doing there. And I think the common denominator there obviously is much more the understanding of social vulnerability, resilience issues, and more recently complexity and complex adaptive systems. So I think what I'm basically saying is, with all of us present, you're kind of shaped by so many different foci out there that it's difficult these days just to say I'm a disaster scholar and this is where I came from. You're kind of shaped by so many different things that interest you. And these days, what I read literally is what I'm busy with in projects and kind of the articles that I'm busy with. So it's kind of sad that you also you need to feed the monster, you need to get your publications out there, and I don't have that luxury to sit and read too many things. But yeah, I should probably make time more for the borderline things, as you mentioned.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, I think that's the problem for all of us. I'm luckily I commute, so I get like an hour a day of reading. But the silver lining of commute. But the thing I wanted to kind of to emphasize, and I think Jason and I have heard this quite a few times already, is how the disaster scholars' names that we kind of keep going back to, right? So our peers, if you wish, like Ben, right, and Tony, and all this great and good scholars that we all respect so much. It's interesting that they have become so prominent, and we kind of almost see there is no literature review that doesn't go without mentioning at least some of these names. But really, all of these people have been influenced very much by critical thinking, right, and kind of critical theory. And then with the generation that came after them completely kind of forgot about it, right, and just started focusing on like disaster scholarship. And I think it's really nice that we're seeing now again this going back to critical theory, to kind of to more political theory. But I guess these are the cyclical nature of evolution of thinking. Hopefully we'll see wider engagement now.
Yeah, I really relate to not feeling like I have the time, Joel, to read what I really want to read, And one thing maybe that's useful, I don't know if other people do this, is like if you do have a commute, I know you use your commute for reading. I'm usually driving if I'm like have that kind of a time, and so I really do love listening to audiobooks when I'm on the move. Octavia E. Butler right now. I'm doing Parable of the Talents. So amazing. But I wanted to come back to like this volume and the essays that everyone's been putting together and talk about your entries for both of you. So let's talk about those. Let's start with Danielle. You wrote about Clyde Woods. So why did you choose to write about him?
Why Clyde Woods? Yeah. I mean, I have long had a fascination with Clyde Woods' work. I think one of the core things that sets apart Woods from other thinkers is, this is first an academic who spent an entire career studying one case study, in this case, the Mississippi Delta. And so when you read Woods' work on the Mississippi Delta, it starts to attain, I think, a level of deep understanding and complexities of thinking through the history of the Delta region that we don't often see. I think we're so used to seeing case studies everywhere, but to see that level of engagement and depth with a case, I think is truly profound. And then, many years ago, as a doctoral student, as I was thinking about, Wood's work, specifically around, disasters, and looking at his history, really seeing that, he kind of accidentally came to disasters, which I think many of us do. A lot of us, weren't formally, trained in this area. We have experiences somehow with disaster that pull us into disaster scholarship, and to see that in his work and recognize that he was, originally trained as a planner. So he was trained under Ed Soja at UCLA, and Dr. Soja was such a massive positive figure in planning theory and in urban studies. And so to see that kind of thought of, planning theory and specifically having a regional approach to planning, which we could definitely get into that more, but that's quite rare to see in the US. There's a real focus on regional scale planning, but there's a real power in seeing, how different communities and neighborhoods that are right next to each other are connected in terms of the built environment and in terms of hazards and disasters. And so it's just such a different way of approaching everything. And so, you can read Development Arrested and really get that like longer history of the Delta region, how structural racism, when we talk about structural racism in terms of Wood's work, we really do mean structural, going really through the history of this region with a fine-tooth comb, different eras of what he calls, plantation regimes through history, showing how these regimes pop up over and over again. How they're sort of built and rebuilt for different eras. And so we can see this longer lineage of structural racism that gets built into not just the built environment and economic systems, but even sort of ethos, the culture, the logic of the Delta region, what he calls the sort of blues epistemology of the Delta region. And so you have someone who had such a depth of knowledge in sort of the regional dynamics of the Delta region. And then in 2005, the South is struck by Hurricane Katrina, and suddenly we have this individual, actually a number of individuals. We also have people in the environmental justice movement who have also been engaging this area of the South for many, many years. But Woods is, one of the individuals who had been studying the South to the point where we really get this very, I think, deep and historicized analysis of what is happening to New Orleans in and through Katrina. And so to me, it's just such an important moment in our understanding of disasters, and specifically for those of us in planning and urban studies to understand how disasters are actually exacerbating those structural racisms, those structures of racism that already exist in regions before disasters. And so it's not just a line with Wood, it's actually something that he has really been understanding and studying extensively. So for those on the listening who are interested in learning more, Clyde Woods has an incredible essay called "Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans?" That's a really powerful essay that was written right as New Orleans or Hurricane Katrina was unfolding. And so really understanding how these longer histories that he's studying are being compounded and exacerbated through the hurricane. So I think that's just, to recognize that contribution, because at least in the US, Hurricane Katrina was such a pivotal moment in disaster studies where we really did start to see the impacts of structural racism. And Woods was a huge part of that story, especially with his posthumous volume, Development, Drown, and Reborn. So I think that's really important to acknowledge that history and acknowledge that so much of what we talk about in terms of racism, and disasters in the US is built on his work. And then other than that, I wanted to mention one more thing too. One of the best things about Woods too is not just looking at structural racism, but looking at the community as actively resisting these structural racisms through history, these plantation logics. And so I think that's really really important. Through that blues epistemology, we can really understand that communities are active and fighting against, disaster racism in all its forms. And so I think that's another, really key component reading his work, is that we see communities not as passive or as docile, but as very actively contesting these racisms through disaster.
Yeah, thanks so much, Danielle. I think it seems like some disaster analysis that we see is still fails to do that. First of all, fails to see community as active, and also I think really doesn't go where Woods went with like a very colorblind or rejecting a colorblind analysis. And so a lot of analysis still tries to be kind of politically correct and
objective.
Yeah, objective, right, apolitical, I would say. And so I think like in your own work, Danielle, you have been, maybe following in those footsteps of Woods, trying to reject that colorblind analysis, see community as active. How do you think, like, what do you think we can do to encourage more people to like adopt these kind of philosophical positions? And what do you think about maybe some of the reasons that people don't do it? Like, what are people afraid of?
I think in the US, we're afraid of really understanding our full history and our real history. That's the main reason why I think we oftentimes don't see these types of analyses. And so I think it's just not having that fearlessness to know that, really, we really need to understand the true histories that are underpinning communities that are facing disasters. There's the common saying in disaster studies that disasters exacerbate the conditions that that existed before the disaster, what Woods calls the disaster before the disaster. And so if we don't really understand these contexts, then we'll have very skewed vision or versions and understandings of what happened through a disaster. We're actually seeing that in LA right now with the LA fires. That, oftentimes I tell my students there's oftentimes a dominant narrative that comes to be after a disaster. And oftentimes that narrative might suit one sort of group within that area that would experience the disaster, oftentimes the most powerful group. In this case in LA, we talk about, actors and actresses losing their homes and, very famous executives in the movie industry, in places like Pacific Palisades, but we don't talk about the experience of the mobile home park residents that exist right outside of Pacific Palisades, and what's their experience, what's their history is very different than the rest of Pacific Palisades. So I think what Woods really teaches us, and I really would hope we would see more in disaster studies, sort of rejecting these colorblind analyses, is that we really should understand the real histories. And I always use a plural there on purpose, that there are multiple experiences that are happening through disaster. And that oftentimes it's, to me, the most important to say for those who are most underrepresented, what are their experiences, and how can we, as scholars, use our position to help those communities get their stories out, especially in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, so that we can actually have a better response in the aftermath of disaster. So yeah, hopefully that, I guess, the question.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. And Jason, haven't we read Development Drown and Reborn with Darian?
We did in book club in one of the early years. I think we read Development Drown and Reborn.
Yeah. Okay. So I was like, have I just read it and then imagined that we read it on a podcast? But no, I have not. It's great. Yeah. Sure. Go, Daniel.
Yeah, I should mention that, in that book, my favorite chapter is the disaster before the disaster, and which talks about how a lot of that abandonment we saw through Katrina, which was kind of cast in the news as like something that was accidental or just a massive like mistake of the sort of response process, was actually what he called planned abandonment, if you look at the history of New Orleans. So I think that's really why it's so important to see these histories, because you can see something that seems random in the aftermath of a hurricane is actually something that has historical groundings, and you can see as intentional, and something that Puerto Ricans have also talked about after Maria, is that abandonment that we saw was actually, it has historicity to it.
Great. Thank you so much. Dorald, now let's talk about your entry. Very different, and your choice was Monfella Ranfele. Why? Tell us more about her. Why did you choose her?
Well, I think first of all, disclaimer. I don't think I'm the right person to talk about Black scholarship and Black consciousness, being a lily white male growing up in apartheid South Africa. So it's quite ironic that that we're having this conversation. But why did I choose her? Well, first and foremost, not from the perspective of choosing a Black scholar. But when your email came through the first time, she was the first person that jumped to mind that influenced a lot of my thinking in terms of social vulnerability and issues in communities that was not mainstream disaster risk reduction scholars. And I immediately thought she's the perfect candidate for this type of chapter, because she is not a disaster scholar. She's a medical doctor, she's a sociologist, she's a community worker, she's an activist, she was a politician for a while as well, and I'm so glad she's not anymore. But that's the area that she came from. And what she was saying really resonated only years later with me when it came to disaster risk issues. Now, how I came about reading her work was, we had a very naughty lecturer in 1992, I think, that sneaked this into the curriculum. I think probably the fathers of old in the previous university where I studied would probably not have allowed us to read a book like that. But he gave us a book called as prescribed reading. And this was done in development studies. And the whole idea was to try and challenge this, the era in which we grew up in. Now, before I went to university, I had to go to the army. I was conscribed. I had to go. I did my year of service. And only then, in my second part of that year that I did, I was posted to Soweto, which is obviously a huge Black township. And that was the first time that the work that I read later on, actually I could see happening in practice. Because we were also kind of white people boxed and told all kinds of weird and wonderful and nonsense. And that was when my eyes opened up, and I realized, my word, this is another world out there, and this is not a good place. There's a lot of things happening that should not be happening. I couldn't believe that people are living in these conditions. We had a total different warped view of what is also happening in many Black communities. And that's where that consciousness of mine kind of switched on, and I realized, okay, well, this is not on. And when I later on with my studies, when I came across her work, it really resonated with what I already saw when I did my military service. And what I really found interesting is how she's, as a very kind person. Now, she was born in the 1940s, late 1940s, just before the start of apartheid. So she had a whole life. Her forming life was in the apartheid system. Yet, as a Black girl, she could rise above her circumstances. Now, back then in the 60s, the best you would find Black girls' occupations they would go into would be teachers or nurses. And she was able to become a medical doctor, which was significant. I mean, this was quite a big thing for her era as well. And not only that, she was able to influence such a lot of development, thought in development, moving on in her direct communities, and later on with the book she wrote, with the interactions she had at many other foreign levels of government, level of interaction, and how she always stayed true to what she believed in. And I think the book called Home was one of those books that said, consider someone else beside yourself. Now, we talked about Ubuntu, which is a philosophy we have in Africa and very much in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Basically means you are because of other people. You shouldn't see yourself outside of the domain of a community of people that's there to assist you. You're not making it on your own. And I think that is her kind of perspective that I picked up, and from the start, where she said that even something like a bed in a hostel can be seen as a home for more than just one person. Now, if we think about it from a Western perspective, and you say, well, a bed is a home, it kind of gets you thinking, like, how is that even possible? And that's what I really enjoyed about her early work, was to recognize that community means something much more than just the physical that we see. It's much more than the infrastructure that we see. It's much more than the development that we see. It actually starts off with considering your fellow human, saying that, who is this person? And they're not so different from me. They've got the same aspirations, the same thing they want for their children, the same kind of outlook on life. We're all in this boat together. But if you look at it from a socio-economic, political perspective, all these different levels. We remain the same, but we are totally different. And that kind of resonated, like I said, later on with me when it comes to trying to understand social vulnerability and resilience issues. Now, interesting enough, something that I never knew of her at the time, and this was now, like I said, early 1990s, was that she was the partner of Steve Biko, which, when I knew this later on, it was like a big thing. Wow, how did I not how did I not make this connection? How did I not know that she was a partner of Steve Biko? But even in that, her contribution was even more significant because of her kindness and how she went about trying to get the message out there, trying to push Black conscious movement through various means. But she was almost like a Gandhi. She didn't believe in an aggressive way of doing it. She believed in, or believe in it, I hope she still believes in it, that through this interaction and through creating an understanding and through seeing each other, there can be progress and there can be, we can address mutual issues. And I think one of the things that I mentioned, which I think she probably became frustrated with, was the political environment in South Africa. Remember, they came out from the backward movements, establishing the South African student organization, and Steve Biko. Then with his death, she still stayed quite very active as an activist and within the ANC structures. And then we went into this era where the ANC lost their way. And I mean, we all know about this. It's not a secret. And I think as a counter to that, she tried to also enter the political environment. And she established a political party which wasn't very successful. And I think she then realized that the monster of politics is not for her. And I'm so glad that as a human being that she could see this and just cut ties and go on with the more important work that she's busy with. Because sometimes you feel the need to change something, but it's not necessarily that avenue that you think you need to follow to change it. And I think the work that she's doing now and that she's done after that is much more significant than trying to change it from a political perspective. And especially in the South African environment where everything is extremely politicized and everything is seen through a race lens. And she was even being told that she's a sellout because now she established a different party than the ANC. And she kind of just retracted from that. And why else did I choose her? Well, I think obviously the way that she challenged the status quo, but also the way how she challenges us to challenge the status quo. In saying that within our physical environment, within our social economic environment, resilience can be built through various means. And although it's a complex term, you need to start somewhere. And that start somewhere means in your community. It means start with what you have, the resources that you have, the knowledge that you have, and just do something. Just get on with it. Just do something and try and make a difference. And I think the other thing that really resonates with me is her perspective on just being kind. I think that throughout her work, that comes through, just be kind. And one of her later works, Conversations with My Sons and Daughters, she actually writes this to the new generation. And one of the things that comes through there is just try and be kind. Before you do something, be kind. And that kind of resonates with the whole thing of Ubuntu. These are other human beings. Let's start off by being kind and then we start solving the problems.
I really like that, this kindness that we don't really see anymore and that we don't really kind of talk about anymore, and maybe it's seen as a weakness, right? Like when someone is kind. What happened to all those fairy tales when kindness always wins? I don't know. Surely it will. But I want to ask you a little bit more about Ubuntu, right? You've mentioned it a few times as kind of the African philosophy and the African wisdom. And as you've already said, so Ubuntu really emphasizes communal interdependence, kind of mutual support, maybe even solidarity, right? And in your opinion, what role these ideas of mutual support, of solidarity, could or should play in our resistance of disaster risk creation?
I think the first thing is that we must realize that there's a lot of capacity and resources in communities. That's the first point. So many times we from intellectual, government, private sector, NGO perspective, want to go into communities and solve their problems. There's a lot of resources. People are well aware of the problems that they have. They are also well aware of how they can solve their own problems. What they don't have necessarily is the resources and the capacities to do that. And I think that's a first point that I feel disaster scholars can learn, not only when it comes to issues of disaster response and humanitarian action, but in trying to understand how a community works, how it fits together, what are the dynamics involved in this community. And we must always remember, it doesn't matter if you grew up in a particular country or you're from a specific race or a specific group. If you go into an unknown community, you're an outsider. Doesn't matter how much you know about them. And you must acknowledge that. And I think that's what she also says, is that acknowledge that you've got a lot of knowledge, but you don't understand all of this. And you must make time to understand it. And I think this is probably where a lot of our efforts to reduce disaster, to reduce vulnerabilities in communities kind of falters, is that too quick, and I'm using the term we know quite widely, go into these communities and quickly do an assessment around variables and say this is the right solution. And we don't take the time, as you had with the old anthropologist, working in communities, trying to understand what it is that makes them tick, and then gradually try to solve the problem. These days, we want to throw money at a problem, and it does not always solve the problem. Actually, money, in many cases, especially in Africa, creates a lot more issues than we solve. So I think that's probably the one message I want to bring home. And the other one is that I think what we miss in terms of Ubuntu is that we must also realize that although we are different groups, the kind of common understanding is everyone is equal, that there's still massive inequalities. And Ubuntu doesn't say we're going to break it down. It says work with it, acknowledge it, and work with it. I mean, if you have in poor conditions, and if you're poor and you live in a community, you will find someone that's prepared to help you that's maybe in the same situation as you. And now the question is being asked now, where's the rich people? Why aren't they helping? Where's the private sector? Why aren't they helping? And I think that's one part of Ubuntu that we miss is, and I'm not saying, and I'm not talking from a socialist perspective, but from the perspective that there's a lot more we can do in our communities, and I'm talking us for South Africa specifically, to raise people up. But it must be done in a very focused, systematic, understanding way of what goes on there. Otherwise, we're just going like a hamster around a wheel. We're not actually addressing the problems. We're just trying to solve what we think the problem is.
Super. Thanks, Doval.
Yeah, I think it's great. You both have kind of focused in on this, I guess, approach to working with communities that is not paternalistic and not like it's based on looking for the things that are strong, the things that are, the resources that are there, the ideas that people have, like really humanizing it. Because I think even for sure disaster studies also just development, humanitarianism often is kind of dehumanizing and paternalistic, and we need to actively reject those approaches. And so I love that both of you have brought these things to the fore. No surprise that it's coming from, inspired by Black scholarship. I think that's not surprising at all that we end up in this place in the discussion. And for communities that have been discarded and targeted for exclusion, that people who are the victims of systems of violence and exclusion, find great ways to work together to fight it. So we can learn so much. But I wanted to ask both of you in the next few minutes about where you hope we go from here, for disaster scholarship and practice. What are your biggest hopes for our community of weird and wonderful people who work in this space? Danielle, how about you first?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, especially, after talking about Clyde Wood's work, just really understanding that there is a historicity to disaster. That I know I have a mentor of mine in disaster studies, Rob Olshansky, who really rejects the idea that a disaster is just an event, the thing that is cataclysmic, but really looking at, for him, he always says, well, disasters stretch into, response, recovery, reconstruction, all of these other aspects, what we call a disaster cycle. But I think it also works going the opposite direction in time, that we can pull back and look at, really, if we sit with the histories of communities that are experiencing disaster, we see the underpinnings of those disasters in the past. And as Woods shows us, that goes, very deep. That goes into not just the built environment. I think sometimes when we say, oh, yes, we've structured disaster before the disaster occurs, oftentimes we're talking about it in terms of, the physical sort of makeup of the built environment, but that goes really into how communities are structured, have interacted, how power has intersected those spaces and those communities. And it goes into the resistance that communities have tried to, in the past, make to these systems of power. And so I think really my hope for disaster scholarship and practice is that we can have more scholars who really sit with spaces and sit with communities to really understand those connections. So in my own work, trying to understand how floods that we see right now in California have actually repeatedly happened in the past. So we've actually done archival work going all the way back to the 18th century and have shown that actually, these floods that we're seeing today have actually occurred in the past. Sometimes, same places in the river have been breaching over and over again. And so this isn't anything new, like how the news portrays it. This is actually something that has deep roots, that the community understands happens to them repeatedly. And we see the same thing in Puerto Rico. And so we also see the same thing in, Mississippi Delta. So I think understanding those histories really allows us to have a completely different perspective of disaster. So that would be my hope, is that we can train scholars to not just kind of jump from disaster to disaster. Everyone's kind of in the US jumping to LA right now and talking about fire, but instead, can we really sit with particular regions and communities, because that'll serve us better as a community. We can trust one another and one another's knowledge in different areas to know really what's happening, and then what that means for our understanding of disasters. Yeah.
If I can follow up on that, Danielle, I just wanted to ask, any advice for researchers that want to do that? What does it require to take that long-term, approach to working with the community? What kind of things have you found to be successful in strategizing, your own time and commitments? Because obviously that's a big commitment, right?
Yeah, it is. in California, we've really taken the perspective of, and my past work in Texas as well, doing risk reduction, working on mitigation. And unfortunately, you know, working in those communities, they've also been struck by hurricanes and storms. And so we've had to deal with active disaster situations, but just actually staying with those communities and trying to, it's, you know, not just looking at, you know, when a disaster occurs, but working with them, you know, when no one else is looking, and really trying to help those communities to address the issues and organizing alongside with them. And I think that's really the key, and not, you know, I'm in California, I'm not doing anything with the LA fires because I don't do work in LA, and not being tempted to rush down there because it's in the news or those sorts of things. I think that's very difficult sometimes for disaster scholars to not be swayed by these bigger disasters that are happening, but how can you sit with regions where, you know, as DeWalt was saying earlier, I thought it was a really good point, you know, where are you really an insider versus an outsider, and really thinking critically through that. I think that's a huge part of this, actually, is thinking, if you are an insider within a community, I feel like you do have, especially studying this work, you do have a responsibility to stay with those communities and really help them to deal with the risks that they face, and also especially through a disaster, to help those communities through disaster.
Yeah, there's a really difficult practical issues around this, because sometimes as researchers, you know, we have funding for a project to achieve certain objectives with the money that we said we would, and that doesn't really align so well with like a long-term commitment to your community.
No, and it doesn't, you know, especially when, you know, disaster funding right now is all going towards major disasters. Sometimes it's difficult to find the individuals who will fund you for, you know, communities that oftentimes, or disasters even, that really aren't in the mainstream news. And yeah, that can be quite difficult. But I found that, you know, being really truthful about, you know, your connections to those communities and your grounding in them, that speaks volumes.
Yeah, thank you. So DeWalt, what about you? What's your biggest hope for disaster scholarship and practice?
Yeah, it's not an easy question, Jason, is it? I mean, I've been around for 30 years, so I think I fall within the second wave of scholars, probably. I think you and Tina probably falls in the third wave.
Just about.
If I have to think about, you know, and basically a lot of myself have been talking about this for quite some time, and you know, reflection on where we came from. I think my generation of scholars kind of, and I'm also talking very general about it, but it feels like we've dropped the baton. I mean, we had Ben Wisner and Terry Cannon and David Alexander and all these scholars that started off pushing the disaster risk agenda, and they kind of changed their thinking. We did this, and you know, along with them in re-looking at what disaster mean and disaster risk issues. But there's kind of this underlying feeling that we kind of dropped the baton, in the sense that we didn't solve some of the critical problems that was highlighted 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. And I think in my back of my mind, this is still something that bugs me, to say that everything has become, or we've realized, I should say, the complexity of the problems that we deal with. It's not just, as Daniela said, that disaster. It is much more than that. That disaster is not just created out of nothing. It doesn't just happen. It is embedded in so many of our systems and so many of our thinking, so much of our development. And I think what I would like to see for disaster scholarship moving forward is hopefully a new generation of more trans and interdisciplinary scholars that look at these problems from various perspectives, but also then trying to find common ground. I think that's one area where my generation kind of missed each other a bit. We were still working a lot in silos. Some people bridged talking to each other, you know, present company included. But there's still this kind of awesome work that's happening in understanding and solving disaster risk and resilience issues, but still in isolation. So I think for years to come, I would love to see, I'm not going to call it just disaster scholarship, but other scholarship moving into the disaster domain and feeding in that understanding, making the field richer, as we've already seen. I mean, when we started off, you could name 5 colleagues on a continent, and that was about the sum of everyone working in disaster studies. Try and do it now. There's thousands of people working in this field, which is absolutely wonderful. But I hope this leads to us solving more critical problems and advocating at a global level for real change, real problem solving. If you go to, we've got another global platform coming up quite soon. And it's as if we're not pushing the boundary much. It is a lot of the same old with a kind of, it's going that same old, it's going that direction. I think we need some significant change. And this has also been said about 60 years ago, that a lot of this change lies in how the political and economic systems are put together. And there's been a nice shake-up internationally by some people on the when it comes to international economy, which in some cases people feel frightened of, but I see it quite as positive, because it's shaking the cage and it's making people to wake up to say we can't maintain the status quo. We have to do something totally different. And what I would personally would like to see is a much stronger bridge between our academia and practice. Now, in Southern Africa, we're very fortunate to be able to do that. I mean, I work with so many African governments, with the African Union Commission in our region, with the SADC, DRR unit, IGAD, ECOWAS, all of these different organizations. And that has made me a much richer scholar, because I've got my nose in practice as well. And I think that is so important, that we focus on probably when it comes to teaching as well, problem-based learning within our environments, and making a real difference with our research, not doing just doing extractive research, but making a difference. As Danielle said, if you do this, think of what is happening in that community and what you may be going to leave behind or not leave behind. And that, to me, I think is something that excites me, that I see this is happening. It's kind of the way that the new generation is thinking. But we have to understand complexity within these systems to solve the problems. Otherwise, we're just going to do the same old, same old.
Thank you, Donald. And this is great. I really like both of your hopes, and I hope that they'll come true. It's been great. It's always great talking to you, and so thank you so much for joining us today. And just before we start the episode, I told Jason that I'm really hungry, and Jason said, "Well, maybe the conversation will kind of nurture you," and it did. I'm not hungry anymore, so maybe I can just survive on intellectual juices. This is great. But no, thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and I hope that everyone who joined us today, you've enjoyed this episode. So now Jason and I are going to take a little summer break, or should I say a reading break. Finally, hopefully we'll find some time to read, and so we will back with the kind of usual this sort of episodes in September. But during the summer months, so in July and August, we will be reading together. You may remember we've been doing it a couple of seasons ago with Camilo Boano, our really good friend, and we want to do something similar. And so the first book that we will be reading is by Glissant, and this is the Poetics of Relation. And the reason we are choosing Glissant is because the very first essay that was submitted for our project this time was by J.C. Gaillard on Glissant. So a slightly random connection, but important nevertheless. So please read this book and join us for the discussion. We will decide on the message soon, so check our social media. We'll post it on Blue Sky, on Instagram, wherever, or maybe even LinkedIn. That's how fun we are. And also we'll share the date. And please let us know if you want to join the live stream and talk to us about the book. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Danielle. Have a good ride.
Thanks.
Thank you. See you.